The
This is
garage
it,
sat where
the
the
new
town
emblem
gave
for the
up
club.
trying,
It's scary. Is that a
past the last
snake?
A
traffic
symbol
light
of
that still cycled through its colors, for no one in particular past the boarded-up feed store and the gas station that hadn't pumped anything in a decade. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, and the gravel turned to dust. Out there on a strip of land between a dried creek bed and a rusted rail line, the Broken Crown Motorcycle Club had built something that looked less like a building and more like a scar on the landscape. Corrugated metal walls held together with mismatched patches, a roof that sagged in the middle where rain collected in a permanent puddle no one bothered to fix. Windows so thick with grime and motor oil they'd gone opaque years ago. A hand-painted sign hung crooked above the rolling door, the letters faded but still legible. Broken Crown MC, members only. The sign wasn't a suggestion. Inside, the air carried its own geography. Layers of cigarette smoke drifted near the ceiling like low clouds. Beneath that, the sharp bite of motor oil and brake fluid mingled with coffee that had been cooking on a hot plate since dawn, reduced to something closer to tar than a beverage. 3 motorcycles sat on hydraulic lifts, their engines pulled apart and spread across workbenches in orderly rows of pistons, gaskets, and timing chains. A 4th bike, a 1974 shovelhead with a cracked frame, leaned against the far wall like a patient waiting for surgery no one had scheduled. The crew moved through their afternoon with the easy rhythm of men who'd been doing this long enough to stop thinking about it. Wrenches rang against steel. A paint-splatter-red radio bled out classic rock from a station that still played deep cuts. Somebody told a joke about a carburetor and a priest. Somebody else laughed too hard and knocked a socket wrench off a bench, and the clatter echoed through the garage like a gunshot, which drew a round of cursing and another round of laughter. Rowan Flint worked the paint bay near the back. He was 43, lean, with forearms mapped in tattoos that told the story of 2 decades on 2 wheels. His current project was a custom fuel tank for a client out of Dayton. Cobalt flames licking up from the base, blending into black at the crest. He worked with a fine brush, his hands steady, his breathing slow. Painting was the only time Rowan went quiet, and the crew had learned to leave him alone when he was in the zone. Beckett Pritchard leaned against a rolling toolbox near the middle of the floor, a bottle of beer sweating in his grip. He was 47, broad-shouldered, with a salt and pepper beard he kept trimmed because his wife told him it made him look less like a convict. Beckett had 3 kids at home, a mortgage he was always one payment behind on, and a loyalty to the Broken Crown that went back 22 years. He was the practical one. Every group needed a man who asked the hard questions, and Beckett never flinched from the asking. Nolan Shea, the youngest patch member at 26, sat on an overturned crate near the door, scrolling through his phone. He'd been with the club just over a year, still learning the rhythms, still figuring out when to speak and when to listen. He had sharp eyes and a talent for technology that the older members grudgingly respected, even if they didn't fully understand it. Colette Marsh occupied a cluttered desk near the office door, surrounded by invoices, receipts, and a laptop that was older than Nolan. She handled the club's books, its correspondence, its paperwork. She was 51, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead, and a directness that could cut through any conversation like a blade through balsa wood. Colette had been around the Broken Crown longer than most of the current members. She'd come in through marriage. Her late husband had been a writer and stayed because leaving never made sense. And then there was Emmett Braxton. Emmett sat in the corner near the space heater, a stack of invoices on his knee, a pen in his hand that he wasn't using. He was 68 years old, and his body showed every mile. Hands thick with arthritis, knuckles swollen fingers that could still grip a wrench but complained about it afterward. His hair had gone white a long time ago, cropped close to his skull. His face was a topographic map of sun-damaged windburn and the particular erosion that comes from decades of squinting into headlights on dark highways. Emmett Braxton was the last founding member of the Broken Crown Motorcycle Club. The others were gone, dead, moved away, or simply dissolved into lives that no longer had room for the road. Emmett remained. He came to the garage every day. He sat in his corner. He watched the younger men work, and he remembered the ones who used to stand where they stood. The afternoon was winding down. The light through the grimy windows had turned amber, and the shadows in the garage were stretching toward evening. Rowan was putting the finishing touches on his flame job. Beckett was on his second beer. Nolan was reading something on his phone that made him frown. Colette was reconciling numbers that refused to reconcile. Nobody was expecting what came through the door. The girl pushed it open with both hands, which told you something about either the weight of the door or the lightness of her frame. She stepped inside and stood there blinking against the Chev from daylight to the garage's permanent dusk. She couldn't have been more than 14. Small for her age, with sharp collarbones visible above the neckline of a jacket that was at least 2 sizes too big. The sleeves were rolled up in thick cuffs to free her hands. Her hair, dark blonde and unwashed, was pulled into a ponytail that had given up on neatness. Her sneakers were worn through at the toes. A backpack hung from one shoulder, the fabric faded and patched with duct tape in 2 places. She stood in the doorway with the stillness of someone calculating. Not frozen, not scared, measuring. Rowan noticed her first. He glanced up from his fuel tank brush still in hand, and his expression shifted from concentration to confusion. "You lost, kid." She shook her head. One small definitive motion. She took a step inside, then another. Her eyes moved around the room, landing on each face, each workbench, each tool rack, cataloging and filing. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to read a room before committing to it. The noise in the garage didn't stop, but it dimmed. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Heads turned. Beckett set his beer down on the toolbox. Nolan looked up from his phone. Colette pushed her glasses down from her forehead and peered at the girl over the rims. Emmett in his corner looked up slowly. He studied her the way a man studies weather rolling in from the west. Patient, assessing, in no hurry to reach a conclusion. "We don't give tours," Beckett said. His tone was blunt, delivered with the directness of a man who said things once and expected them to land. The girl didn't flinch. She walked straight to the nearest workbench, swung her backpack off her shoulder and set it down. Then she turned to face the room. "I can paint," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Bikes, helmets, tanks, fenders. Whatever you need, I'll do it for tips." For a beat, the garage held its breath. Then someone laughed. Not mean-spirited, just the involuntary response to something so unexpected it short-circuited any other reaction. A teenage girl standing in a garage full of men who'd been riding and wrenching since before she was born, offering to paint their machines for pocket change. Rowan smirked. He set his brush down and crossed his arms, leaning back against the paint bay partition. "That right, you got a portfolio Picasso." She didn't answer the question. Instead, she reached into the inside pocket of her oversized jacket and pulled out something small. A napkin, folded into quarters, wrinkled, stained along one edge with what might have been coffee or road grime. She held it with both hands, and despite the casual way she'd walked in, despite the steadiness of her voice, her fingers handled that napkin like it was made of glass. She unfolded it, carefully, one fold at a time, smoothing each crease against the workbench surface. Then she slid it toward Rowan. He leaned in, the smirk on his face dissolved. The napkin held a drawing, ink from a ballpoint pen, the cheap kind you'd find in a motel lobby or a bus station vending machine. But the draftsmanship was anything but cheap. The lines were deliberate and precise, laid down with a confidence that belied the humble medium. The image showed a custom emblem, a fractured crown split down the center with a coiled serpent threading through the break. Flames rose from the base, rendered in cross-hatching, so fine it created the illusion of movement. Inside the design, worked into the negative space with surgical precision, were 2 initials. GC. Beneath the initials, a date. Rowan stared at the drawing, his arms uncrossed. He took a step back from the workbench and the color left his face. From across the garage, a chair scraped against concrete. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. Emmett Braxton was on his feet. He crossed the floor in 3 long strides, his boots heavy on the stained cement, and he reached the workbench before anyone could speak. He picked up the napkin. His hands were shaking. Not a subtle tremor, a visible full-body vibration that started in his fingers and traveled up through his wrists to his elbows. He stared at the drawing for a long time. The rest of the garage watched him. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The radio played on, oblivious, filling the silence with a guitar solo that nobody heard. "Where did you get this?" Emmett's voice came out rough, scraped raw like he'd swallowed gravel. The girl looked at him. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She met his gaze with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone her age and her size. "My brother drew it." "Your brother?" "Garrett Caldwell." The name landed in the garage like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of recognition spread outward, touching every face. Beckett's jaw tightened. Rowan took another step back. Colette removed her glasses entirely and set them on the desk. Nolan looked around confused. He'd only been patched in a year. He didn't know the name, but he could read the room well enough to understand that something fundamental had just shifted. Garrett Ghost Caldwell. The name belonged to a man who'd been dead for 5 years, and in those 5 years, he'd become something larger than the person he'd been in life. Ghost had been one of the 4 founding members of the Broken Crown Motorcycle Club, a rider who could make a machine sing on a straightaway and whisper through a curve, a storyteller who could hold a room for hours with nothing but his voice and a beer, and a painter whose custom work was so distinctive, so immediately recognizable, that people still talked about it half a decade after his last brushstroke dried. Ghost had gone down on a rain-slick highway outside of Columbus, riding alone late at night, heading back from a solo run. The police report said he hit a patch of standing water and lost traction. The bike went sideways. Ghost went into the guardrail. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. The club had buried him with full honors. They'd ridden in a procession that stretched for a quarter-mile, engines rumbling in unison, a rolling thunder that shook windows and houses along the route. They'd spoken words over his grave. They'd poured whiskey on the earth. And then, because there was no other choice, they'd gone on living. But no one in the Broken Crown had ever mentioned a sister. Emmett's jaw worked. His eyes moved from the napkin to the girl and back again, searching for something that would make this make sense. His grip on the napkin tightened, creasing the edges. Ghost never said he had family. He didn't talk about me much. The girl's voice held more weight than its volume suggested. But he told me that if I ever needed help, I should find you. He said you'd know what to do. Rowan found his voice. And what exactly do you need help with? She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, a pause so brief that most people would have missed it entirely. But Emmett caught it. He'd spent a lifetime reading the silences between words, and this silence carried weight. I need work, she said. That's all. It wasn't all. Every person in that room could feel it the way you feel a storm building before the first cloud appears. Something heavier sat beneath her words, pressing upward, and she was holding it down with everything she had. But nobody pushed. Not yet. The Broken Crown had seen enough of life's damage to know that truth comes out on its own schedule. Rowan studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at Emmett. The old man was still holding the napkin, his thumb tracing the lines of the fractured crown, the serpent, the initials. G.C. Garrett Caldwell. Ghost. All right, Rowan said. His voice had lost its edge. You want to paint? Let's see what you can do. He turned to the shelf behind the paint bay and grabbed a stripped gas tank. Bare metal sanded smooth, ready for primer. He set it on the workbench in front of her. Then he laid out a set of brushes, a selection of paint cans, and a palette. 1 hour, he said. No tracing, no stencils, no references. Show me what Ghost taught you. She didn't hesitate. She pulled her hair back tighter, secured it with a rubber band from her wrist, and rolled her sleeves up past her elbows. Her forearms were thin but steady. She selected 3 brushes, examined each one, set 2 aside, and kept the finest. She opened 4 paint cans, studied the colors, mixed 2 of them on the palette until she found a shade that satisfied her. Then she started. At first, the crew drifted back to their tasks. Engines needed attention. Parts needed ordering. The radio played on, but as the minutes passed one by one, they found reasons to move closer. Rowan was first. He positioned himself where he could watch without hovering. Arms folded, his professional eye tracking every stroke. Beckett wandered over with his beer. Nolan abandoned his phone. Even Colette left her desk. The girl worked fast, not rushed but efficient. Her brush moved across the metal surface with a fluidity that spoke of muscle memory, of hours and hours of practice that had burned the mechanics into her nervous system until thought and execution became a single act. She didn't sketch first. No pencil guidelines, no rough outlines. She started with color and let the design emerge, building layers, adding depth, allowing the image to reveal itself like a photograph developing in a solution. The lines were clean, not just competent, exceptional. Her shading moved from subtle gradients to hard edges with a confidence that most professional painters took years to develop. And as the design took shape, as the image on the gas tank began to coalesce into something coherent and alive, a recognition passed through the gathered men like an electric current. They knew this style. They'd seen it before on every bike Ghost had ever touched. That same boldness. That same refusal to play it safe with color and composition. But filtered through a different sensibility. Younger, sharper, rawer. If ghost work had been a deep river, smooth and powerful, this was a mountain stream. The same water but running faster, cutting deeper, finding new channels through familiar rock. When she set the brush down, half the garage had gone quiet. They stood in a loose semicircle around the workbench, staring at the gas tank like it had spoken. The design showed a single motorcycle headlight, piercing through darkness, the beam fragmenting into a spray of fractured light, each shard carrying a different color. It was aggressive and delicate at the same time, beautiful and slightly dangerous. Emmett stepped forward. He reached out and ran his fingertips along the edge of the design, careful to avoid the wet paint tracing the boundary between metal and art. "He taught you this?" She nodded. "Every weekend before he died." Emmett didn't respond right away. He stood there, his fingers still hovering over the painted surface, and looked at her. Really looked. Past the oversized jacket and the worn sneakers and the tangled ponytail. Past the careful composure and the measured voice. He looked at her like a photograph found in a drawer. Something you didn't know existed. Something that changes the story you thought you understood. She wasn't a random kid who'd wandered in off the road. She was Ghost's little sister. And she'd come looking for the only family she believed she had left. Her name was Wren Caldwell. She stayed. Emmett didn't issue an invitation. There was no formal discussion, no vote, no announcement. He simply didn't tell her to leave, and in the language of the Broken Crown, that was permission enough. After the gas tank, Rowan handed her a helmet that needed refreshing, then a fender with a faded eagle that wanted new life, then another tank, this one for a member's personal ride. She worked in the corner near the paint bay, quiet and methodical, while the crew moved around her. By evening, she'd completed 3 pieces, each one carrying that unmistakable ghost signature filtered through her own emerging voice. She slept in the back office that night. Someone left a wool blanket folded on the couch. Someone else left a sandwich wrapped in foil and a bottle of water on the filing cabinet. She didn't ask for any of it. She just curled up on the couch, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and fell asleep with the efficiency of someone who had learned to rest wherever safety appeared, however briefly. The next morning, Beckett found her already awake. She sat cross-legged on the couch, a battered notebook open on her knee, sketching with a pencil that was worn down to a stub. He leaned against the doorframe, a steaming mug in his hand, and watched her for a moment before speaking. "You got people looking for you." She kept drawing. Her pencil didn't pause. "Probably. That going to be a problem for us?" She looked up. Her eyes were steady, clear, assessing him the same way she'd assessed the garage when she first walked in. "I don't know yet." Beckett took a long sip of his coffee. He had 3 children. He'd sat up with fevers and nightmares and report cards and broken hearts. He knew what it looked like when a kid was carrying something too heavy for their frame. He also knew the cost of getting tangled in someone else's crisis. "Where did you come from?" She closed the notebook. "A group home, 2 counties over. And they just let you walk out." "They didn't let me do anything." There was a precision to that sentence. Not bitterness. Something colder. A statement of fact delivered with the clinical detachment of someone who had stopped expecting the world to be fair and had started simply navigating it. Beckett studied her for another moment, then nodded once and walked away. He didn't push. Not because he didn't want answers, but because he'd learned that the fastest way to get someone talking was to stop asking questions. Over the next few days, the story surfaced in fragments. Wren didn't volunteer information freely. She parceled it out in small, carefully measured doses, and only when she felt safe enough to release each piece. The crew understood this. They'd seen enough people carrying invisible weight to know that some loads could only be set down one handful at a time. It was Colette who finally drew the full picture. Colette had a gift for conversation that made it feel like something other than interrogation. She didn't sit Wren down and ask pointed questions. She brought food. She sat nearby. She talked about inconsequential things. The weather, a recipe she'd tried, a problem with the club's accounting software. She filled the air with ordinary words, and gradually Wren began filling the gaps. She'd been in the foster care system since Garrett died. 5 years, 3 months. She'd moved through a series of placements, each one a different shade of temporary. A family in Springfield who were kind but overwhelmed, already managing 4 other foster children in a 3-bedroom house. A couple in Marion who argued constantly and forgot to buy groceries. A single woman in Zanesville who treated Wren like an inconvenience she was being paid to tolerate. And then the group home, Shepherd's Gate. It was called, though the name carried an irony so heavy it bent under its own weight. a state-funded residential facility for minors who'd fallen through every other crack the system had to offer. Wren had been placed there 8 months ago, and within a week she understood what kind of place it was. Rules without logic, curfews that shifted depending on which staff member was on duty, punishments that bore no relationship to offenses. A girl lost outdoor privileges for a month because she asked for a second helping at dinner. A boy was moved to an isolation room because he cried after lights out. The staff operated with the casual cruelty of people who'd stopped seeing their charges as children and started seeing them as problems to be managed. Wren had mentioned her brother once. During intake, when a social worker asked about family history, she'd said his name, Garrett at Caldwell. She'd said he was a painter and a motorcycle rider and the best person she'd ever known. The social worker had written something in her file and told her to stop living in the past. When Wren asked if she could keep Garrett's dog tags, two small metal rectangles she'd carried since his funeral, worn smooth by her fingers, the intake officer told her that personal items were a privilege, not a right. They went into a locked drawer and Wren never saw them again. A supervisor named Kendrick found her sketchbook 3 weeks into her stay. Wren had been drawing ghost motorcycles from memory. Every exhaust pipe he'd customized. Every flame pattern he'd taught her to layer. The fractured crown emblem he'd worn on his cut. Page after page of meticulous, loving recreation drawn with whatever pens and pencils she could scavenge. Kendrick flipped through the notebook. He didn't comment on the quality of the work. He didn't ask about the subject matter. He looked at the drawings with the flat disinterest of a man reviewing a grocery list, and then he tossed the notebook into the trash can beside his desk. Wren watched it land. She didn't protest. She didn't cry. She filed the moment away in the same place she'd filed every other injustice since Garrett died. A place inside her that was growing larger and colder with each new addition. She waited until lights out. She waited until the hallway monitor made his rounds and the building settled into its uneasy nighttime silence. Then she climbed out of bed, retrieved her sketchbook from the dumpster behind the kitchen, and walked out the side door that someone always forgot to lock. She'd been moving ever since. Sleeping in bus stations when the weather turned cold, and fast food restaurants where the night staff didn't care under bridges when there was no better option. She did odd jobs for cash, swept floors, washed dishes, drew portraits for tourists outside a county fair for $5 each. She stayed ahead of the system by never staying in one place long enough to be noticed. She had one destination, one name, one address she'd memorized from a letter Garrett had written years ago, a letter he'd hidden inside the lining of the jacket she now wore. A letter that told her where to go if everything fell apart. Colette listened to all of this without interrupting. She sat across from Wren in the back office, her coffee growing cold in her hands, and she absorbed every word. When Wren finished, the silence between them felt earned, respectful. "Ghost never told us about you," Colette said gently. "Why do you think that was?" Wren shrugged. "He kept his world separate. He said the club was important, but so was I. He didn't want those things touching." "Did he ever try to get you out before the accident?" Something flickered behind Wren's eyes, a shadow passing across a sunlit wall. "He said he was working on something. He said it was going to take time, but he was going to fix it. Then the accident happened and everything just fell apart." Colette nodded. She made a mental note. If Garrett had been working on something formal, something legal, there would be a paper trail, and paper trails could be followed. That night, after the crew had gone home and the garage had settled into its after-hours quiet, Colette sat at her desk and began digging. She pulled up the club's old records, archived files that hadn't been opened in years, stored on a hard drive that predated her laptop by half a decade. She searched for Garrett's name. His file was sparse. Membership date, dues paid through the year of his death, emergency contact listed as Emmett Braxton. No mention of family, no mention of a sister. But buried in a subfolder labeled legal correspondence, she found something else, a document request from the county family court. A petition filed 4 years and 7 months ago, just months before Garrett's death. A petition for legal guardianship of a minor child. Wren Caldwell, age 9 at the time of filing. Colette's breath caught. She opened the attached documents. The petition was thorough. Garrett had hired a lawyer, a cheap one, judging by the formatting, but competent. He'd submitted character references. He'd documented his income, his living situation, his plans for Wren's education. He'd done everything the system asked him to do. The petition had been denied. The reason cited was Garrett's association with the Broken Crown Motorcycle Club. The court-appointed evaluator had deemed him unfit based on lifestyle concerns. Wrong associates, wrong environment. A notation in the margin referenced an incident report connected to the club, though the details were sealed. The evaluator's conclusion was clinical and final. The petitioner's current affiliations present an unacceptable risk to the welfare of the minor. Colette kept reading. Attached to the denial was a second document, a complaint filed with the state's Child Welfare Division regarding conditions at Shepherd's Gate Group Home. The complaint was dated 3 weeks after the custody denial. It cited specific allegations: inappropriate disciplinary measures, confiscation of personal property, emotional abuse disguised as behavioral management. The complaint had been filed by Garrett Caldwell. It had been acknowledged, logged, and closed without investigation. Insufficient evidence to warrant action. Case closed. Colette sat back in her chair. The screen glowed in the dark office. She read the denial letter again. She read the closed complaint again. She printed both documents. She held them in her hands and felt the weight of what they represented. Garrett had tried. He had done everything right. He had hired a lawyer, filled out forms, submitted references, and begged the system to let him take care of his own sister. And the system had looked at his leather vest and his motorcycle and his brothers and decided that a group home where children were punished for crying was a better option. Then Garrett had fought back. He'd filed a complaint about the conditions Ren was living in, and the system had filed his complaint in a drawer and forgotten about it. And then Garrett had died on a wet highway alone in the dark, and Ren had been left to fend for herself in a place her brother had tried to rescue her from. Colette brought the documents to Emmett that night. She found him in the garage alone, sitting in his corner near the space heater. The invoices were still on his knee, but he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the napkin. Ghost's napkin. He'd kept it. She handed him the printouts without a word. Emmett read them slowly. His lips moved slightly the way they did when he was processing something that resisted comprehension. When he finished, he set the papers down on his knee on top of the invoices and stared at the wall. He tried, Emmett said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, and they stopped him. Because of us, because of the club. Emmett closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were harder. Which means this isn't just about a runaway kid. The system failed her before Garrett ever hit that guardrail. Colette nodded. What do we do? Emmett looked toward the paint bay. The lights were off, but he could see the outline of the workbench where Ren had been working, the faint gleam of wet paint on the pieces she'd completed. He imagined her in the back office, asleep on the couch, her sketchbook under her arm, her brother's jacket pulled tight around her shoulders. We don't send her back, he said. It was Colette who told the club. She called a meeting the next afternoon while Ren was absorbed in a new project, a helmet commission from a writer who'd heard about her work through the grapevine. The crew gathered in the back room. Door closed, voices kept low. Colette laid out the documents. Ghost custody petition. The denial, the sealed incident reports, the complaint Ghost had filed and the system had buried. She presented the facts methodically without editorializing and let the room draw its own conclusions. Beckett was the first to speak. So we're harboring a runaway minor whose brother tried to get custody and got rejected. And now we think we can do what he couldn't. We're not harboring anyone, Emmett said from his corner. She came to us. The law doesn't see it that way. The law didn't see Ghost complain either. Beckett's jaw tightened. I hear you, Emmett. I do. Ghost was our brother. But sheltering a 14-year-old girl who ran from a state facility, that's not a favor. That's a felony. We've spent years staying clean. One phone call and everything we've built goes up in smoke. She's Ghost's sister, Emmett said. I know who she is, but sentiment doesn't hold up in court. The room split. Rowan stayed quiet, which was unusual. He sat with his arms folded, his eyes moving between Emmett and Beckett, like a spectator at a match whose outcome he couldn't predict. Nolan, too new to carry much weight in these discussions, watched and listened. Colette had said her piece and was waiting for the room to catch up. Emmett stood. The chair scraped against the concrete and the sound silenced the murmuring. Ghost rode with us for 11 years, he said. He painted every bike in this garage. He buried 2 brothers alongside us and never once asked for anything in return. He tried to save that girl and the system punished him for being one of us. Now his sister walks through our door carrying his art in her pocket, and we're going to argue about liability. The room went still. We owe him more than a headstone and a toast once a year, Emmett continued. We owe him this. Beckett rubbed his face with both hands. He looked tired. He looked like a man who knew he was about to agree to something that would cost him sleep. Fine, he said, But we do this right, not just feelings and good intentions. We figure out what the legal options are. We protect ourselves while we protect her. Emmett nodded. The meeting ended without resolution, but with a direction. Colette would compile everything into a file. Beckett would reach out to a lawyer he knew, and they'd keep Wren close, keep her working, keep her safe until they had a plan. But the plan was about to become urgent. Nolan Shea was the one who found it. He'd been helping Colette organize the club's digital archives, a sprawling mess of old emails, scanned documents, and financial records that had accumulated over the years without any organizing principle. He was methodical about it, sorting files into folders, flagging duplicates, cleaning up a decade of digital clutter. Deep in the archive, he found a thread of emails that didn't belong. They were from an external address, routed through a generic account, and they were dated close to the time of Ghost custody petition. Someone had been inquiring about the Broken Crown. Background checks, association patterns, membership rosters, financial records. The inquiry had been thorough, professional, and targeted. Nolan traced the emails back to their origin. They'd come from a law firm in Cincinnati, a firm that, according to its website, specialized in private investigations and legal consulting. The firm's client list was confidential, but in one of the emails a name had slipped through the redaction. Dominic Hargrove. Nolan didn't recognize it. He brought the email thread to Colette. She read the name and her expression changed. The color drained from her face slowly like water seeping out of cracked porcelain. Hargrove, she said quietly. He ran with the Ashen Wolves. Nolan leaned forward. Who are the Ashen Wolves? Rival club, based out of Southern Ohio back in the day. Fell apart about 4 years ago after their leadership collapsed. But before that, they were serious, territorial, dangerous when they wanted to be. What happened to Hargrove? Colette set the printout down. His brother died in a motorcycle crash. Same night Ghost went down. Nolan felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. Same night. Official reports called them separate incidents. Different highways. Ghost hit standing water on Route 33 and went into a guardrail. Hargrove's brother lost control on Route 23 about an hour later, miles away. Pure coincidence, according to the State Patrol. But the Ashen Wolves didn't buy it. They believed Ghost caused the crash somehow, ran him off the road or was racing him or provoked something that led to the accident. They wanted blood, Hargrove especially. His brother was all he had. Did Ghost do it? Colette shook her head. Garrett was a lot of things, but he wasn't reckless with other people's lives. Emmett was with him earlier that evening, said they'd been on a run together, split up at a junction, and Ghost headed home alone. He hit oil on the highway and went down. Nothing more to it than bad luck on a bad night. But Hargrove doesn't believe that. Hargrove believes Ghost killed his brother and then died before he could answer for it. And when you can't get revenge on a dead man, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Nolan pulled up more recent records. The law firm Hargrove had hired was still active. Its recent billing records, accessible through a public database of court filings, showed ongoing work for a private client. The work included surveillance, skip tracing, and location services. And there was more. Nolan found a filing from 3 weeks ago. The law firm had engaged a private investigator who specialized in locating missing minors. The investigator had been active in the area for weeks, asking questions at bus stations, homeless shelters, and rest stops along the highway corridor between Columbus and the eastern counties. Colette stared at the screen, her stomach tightened into a fist. He's been following her, she said. They brought everything to Emmett that night. The club gathered in the back room for the second time in as many days. The door was closed, the radio was off. When Colette laid out what Nolan had discovered, the room went silent in a way that felt physical. A density in the air, a weight pressing down on every shoulder. Beckett spoke first. So this isn't just about child services finding out she's here. Someone is actively hunting her. Looks that way, Colette said. Emmett rubbed his jaw. The arthritis in his hands made the motion stiff, painful. Hargrove wants revenge. He couldn't get it from Ghost, so he's going after Ghost's sister. What's his play? Rowan asked. He'd been silent through both meetings, but his voice now carried an edge that the others recognized. Rowan angry was Rowan quiet. Rowan asking questions meant he was already planning. He doesn't need to snatch her, Colette said. He just needs to make sure she ends up back in the system. Back in a place where she's vulnerable. Maybe a place where he has connections where he can make her life as miserable as possible without ever touching her himself. Beckett swore under his breath. He glanced toward the door, toward the garage beyond it, where Wren was working late again. She'd been staying up past midnight, headphones and brush in hand, lost in the rhythm of creation, That was her inheritance from a brother 5 years in the ground. She'd started something new, something big. A mural on the far wall of the paint bay covering a surface that had been blank concrete for as long as anyone could remember. The piece was massive, stretching 12 feet wide and 8 feet tall. It showed the broken crown riding together through flames. Every member past and present rendered with her precise, relentless attention to detail. At the center of the formation rode Garrett, Ghost, leaning into a turn, his bike roaring beneath him, his expression fierce and alive and unafraid. And behind him, barely visible, sketched in light pencil lines that hadn't yet been committed to paint, was a smaller figure, a girl on a motorcycle, unfinished, still becoming. She doesn't know about Hargrove, Beckett said. And we're not telling her, Emmett said. His voice carried a firmness that left no room for debate. She's been through enough. We handle this ourselves. How? Rowan asked. Emmett looked around the room, at Beckett, who had children of his own, and understood what it meant to stand between a kid and the world. At Colette, who had already proven she could dig up the truth when the truth was trying to stay buried. At Nolan, whose facility with technology had cracked open a door that everyone else would have walked past. At Rowan, whose quiet intensity could be channeled into something protective and fierce. We make sure she's protected, Emmett said. Legally, we get ahead of Hargrove before he gets ahead of us. And if we can't, Beckett asked, if the state comes knocking and all we've got to show them is a stack of good intentions, then we fight, Emmett said, same as Ghost would have done. The room absorbed this. Beckett wanted to argue. He had every practical reason to push back every rational justification for protecting himself and his family first. But he also had a memory. Ghost sitting in this same room laughing at a joke Beckett couldn't even remember, now his hands stained with paint, his eyes bright. Ghost, who had ridden beside them for 11 years and never once failed to show up when it mattered. And he had another image. Wren standing in the paint bay, her brush moving across that wall, bringing Ghost back to life one careful stroke at a time. Building a family in paint because the world had denied her one in flesh. All right, Beckett said, but we do this smart. We get a lawyer, we build a case. We don't just throw ourselves in front of the train and hope it stops. Emmett nodded. Colette pulled together everything we've got. The custody petition, the incident reports, the complaints Ghost filed. Everything that shows the system failed her before we ever entered the picture. On it, Colette said. Nolan, keep digging on Hargrove. I want to know where he is, who he's working with, and what his next move is. Nolan nodded. And Rowan, Emmett turned to the painter. Keep her busy. Keep her safe. Don't let her know we're worried. Rowan glanced toward the paint bay. Through the window in the door, he could see the mural's outline, the fleet of riders surging through Flame Ghost. At the center, the ghost of a girl behind him. She's got talent, Rowan said quietly. That piece is going to be something when it's done. Yeah, Emmett said. He looked toward the mural too, and his eyes lingered on the unfinished figure, the girl on the motorcycle drawn in pencil, waiting for paint, waiting for a commitment, waiting to become real. It will. The garage settled into an uneasy quiet after the meeting broke. Colette stayed at her desk, compiling files. Nolan hunched over his laptop, tracing digital footprints. Beckett went home to his family, his mind heavy, his step slow. Rowan walked to the paint bay and stood beside Wren, who was adding details to one of the bikes in the mural, and he watched her work without speaking. She painted Ghost's motorcycle with an intimacy that went beyond technical skill. She knew the curve of every pipe, the angle of every mirror, the exact placement of every scratch and dent. She painted from love, and it showed. The machine on the wall wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a portrait of the man who'd ridden it, rendered in chrome and steel in motion. Rowan watched for a long time. Then he picked up a brush, mixed a color, and began working on the background beside her, filling in the flames, deepening the shadows. He didn't say a word, and neither did she, and the two of them painted side by side in a silence that felt more like conversation than any words could have. Outside, the night settled over the garage like a held breath. Somewhere to the south, in an office in Cincinnati, a private investigator was filing a report that would set everything in motion. And somewhere in between, Dominic Hargrove was waiting patient and methodical for the moment when Ghost's little sister would be dragged back into the system he intended to weaponize against her. But inside the garage, in the warm glow of work lights, in the smell of fresh paint, Wren Caldwell kept painting. She didn't know what was coming. She didn't know about Hargrove, about the investigator, about the ticking clock that had already started its countdown. She knew only that her brother had told her to find these people, and she had found them. She knew that for the first time in 5 years, she had a roof, a meal, and a purpose. And she knew that the girl on the wall behind Ghost was still unfinished, still waiting, still becoming something she hadn't yet decided she was allowed to be. Wren noticed the change before anyone told her anything. She had spent 5 years reading rooms the way other children read books, and the garage was no different. She cataloged every shifted glance, every conversation that went quiet when she walked into range, every smile that arrived half a second too late to be genuine. It started small. Emmett stopped lingering near the paint bay when she worked. He'd been doing it every evening since she arrived, sitting in a folding chair with his invoices, watching her paint with the unhurried attention of a man who had nowhere better to be. Comforting, present. Now the chair sat empty. When she caught his eye across the garage, he looked away a beat too fast, and in that beat, she read everything she needed to know. Something had changed, something they weren't telling her. Beckett, who had always been direct, suddenly became careful. He stopped asking her questions over morning coffee. Instead, he brought her food, set it down, and left without the easy banter that had begun to develop between them. Colette spent long hours at her desk with the door half closed, her voice a murmur on the phone that stopped when footsteps approached. Nolan barely looked up from his laptop anymore, and when he did, his expression carried the particular tightness of someone holding information that wanted out. Even Rowan, who communicated almost entirely through proximity and shared silence, had shifted. He still painted beside her in the evenings, but his brushstrokes had become distracted. He'd stop mid-stroke, stare at nothing, then resume with a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Wren absorbed all of this. She filed it. She waited. And when waiting stopped feeling productive, she went looking for answers on her own. It happened on a Tuesday evening. The crew had cleared out early, which was unusual. Colette had gone home with her laptop tucked under her arm, which was more unusual still. The garage was empty except for Wren and the hum of the space heater. She'd been painting the mural all afternoon, adding texture to the road surface beneath the rider's wheels, building up layers of asphalt gray and oil slick black that caught the work lights and seemed to glow. She set her brush down and walked to the back of the garage, past the paint bay, past the office where she slept, to a storage room she'd noticed but never entered. The door was unlocked. Inside, shelves lined the walls, stacked with parts bins, old rally banners, and cardboard boxes furred with dust. She found what she was looking for on the top shelf, pushed behind a case of motor oil. A wooden crate unmarked, about the size of a toolbox. She pulled it down, carried it to the workbench, and opened it. The contents smelled like leather and time. A folded bandana, faded red. A set of spark plugs wrapped in cloth. 3 photographs, their edges curling. And beneath the photographs, 2 things that stopped Wren's breath. The first was a dog tag, not the one that had been confiscated at Shepherd's Gate. A second one, a spare. She picked it up and held it in her palm, feeling the familiar weight, reading the familiar name stamped into the metal. Garrett Caldwell. She closed her fingers around it and pressed her fist against her chest. The second item was an envelope, unsealed. Inside, a letter handwritten on lined paper torn from a notebook. Ghost handwriting. She would have recognized it in the dark by touch alone, the way his letters leaned slightly forward, always in a hurry to reach the next word. The letter was unfinished. It began with her name and ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off into a line that ran to the edge of the page, as if he'd been interrupted or had run out of something more important than ink. She read it standing up in the dim light of the storage room, her back against the shelving unit, her brother's dog tag clenched in one hand and his words held carefully in the other. The letter was addressed to her, and it was clear from the first line that Ghost had never intended for anyone else to read it. He wrote the way he talked, direct and warm, with a current of urgency running beneath the surface. He told her he was filing paperwork. He told her he'd hired a lawyer. He told her that the system was slow and the odds weren't great, but he was going to fight for her until there was nothing left to fight with. And then near the bottom of the page, he wrote something that changed everything Wren thought she understood. He wrote that someone was working against him. A man from the past, he called him. Someone who carried a grudge that had nothing to do with Wren, but had everything to do with making Ghost's life as difficult as possible. This man had connections, Ghost wrote. He had money. And he had a specific interest in making sure that Ghost's custody petition never saw the inside of a courtroom. The letter ended there. The sentence broke off. The pen line trailed into nothing. Wren read it twice, then she folded it, put it back in the envelope, and placed the envelope in the inside pocket of her jacket, next to the lining where Ghost's original letter, the one with the broken crown's address, had been hidden for 5 years. She kept the dog tag, too. She hung it around her neck, tucked it beneath her shirt, and felt it settle against her sternum like a second heartbeat. Then she went to find Emmett. He was in the garage's small kitchen, a room that barely deserved the name. A counter, a sink, a microwave, and a coffee maker that had been running since the Clinton administration. He was standing at the counter with his back to the door, pouring coffee into a mug that had the broken crown logo on its side. "I found Ghost's box," Wren said. Emmett's hand paused. The coffee continued to pour, nearly overflowing the mug before he caught it and set the pot down. He didn't turn around. "I read the letter." Now he turned. His face was composed, but his eyes gave him away. Beneath the carefully maintained calm, she could see the calculation. He was deciding how much to tell her. She recognized the process because she'd watched adults do it her entire life. Measure the child, decide what they can handle, edit accordingly. "Don't do that," Wren said. "Do what?" "Decide for me what I'm old enough to hear. I've been sleeping in bus stations and dumpster diving for my own sketchbook. I think we're past the point of age appropriate." Emmett studied her, the coffee steamed between them untouched. Outside, the wind pushed against the metal walls of the garage, and the corrugated sheets hummed a low, tuneless note. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He almost smiled at that. Almost. The corner of his mouth twitched, and something that might have been admiration passed behind his eyes before he caught it and put it away. He told her everything. Dominic Hargrove, the Ashen Wolves, the crash that killed Hargrove's brother the same night Ghost went down, the years of smoldering rage that had never found a satisfying target, the law firm hired to dig into the broken crown, the background checks designed to torpedo Ghost's custody petition, the private investigator who'd been asking questions at bus stations and shelters for weeks, tracking a 14-year-old girl across 2 counties. Wren listened without interrupting. She stood with her arms folded across her chest, her weight balanced evenly on both feet. Her expression didn't change. Not during the part about Hargrove's brother, not during the part about the custody petition being sabotaged, not during the part about the private investigator. When Emmett finished, the kitchen was silent. The coffee maker gurgled. The wind hummed against the walls. "How long have you known?" Wren asked. "A few days. And you weren't going to tell me. We were trying to protect you by keeping me blind." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an accusation. It was an observation delivered with the flat precision of someone who had run out of patience for being managed. "I've been blind my whole life. People deciding what I need to know, what I'm ready for. The group home did it. The social workers did it. Ghost did it too, keeping me separate from the club, trying to protect me by hiding me. And look where it got us." Emmett didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to. She was right, and they both knew it. Wren unfolded her arms. She placed both hands flat on the counter, leaning forward slightly, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted. Quieter, more deliberate. The voice of someone who had stopped reacting and started thinking. "Hargrove wants me back in the system," she said. "That's his play. He can't touch me directly without exposing himself, so he uses the system as a weapon. Get me pulled from here, placed somewhere he can influence. Somewhere he can make sure I spend the rest of my childhood paying for what he thinks Ghost did to his brother." Emmett nodded slowly. "That's what we figure." "Then we don't let him dictate the timeline." Wren straightened up. "He's expecting you to hide me. He's expecting you to circle the wagons and wait for child services to come knocking, and when they do, he expects you to have nothing but good intentions in a garage full of motorcycles. That's not enough. That's never enough. What are you suggesting?" "We go to them first. We file before he does. We get a lawyer, build a case for legal guardianship, and present it to a court before Hargrove's investigator can force the issue. We control the narrative instead of letting him control it." Emmett looked at her. He'd been watching her since the moment she walked into the garage, and in that time he'd seen Ghost in her face and her hands, in the way she attacked a blank surface with paint and turned it into something that breathed. But standing here now in the fluorescent light of a kitchen that smelled like burnt coffee and motor oil, he saw something else. Something that wasn't Ghost at all. Ghost had been brave, loyal, fierce when he needed to be. But Ghost had also been reactive. He'd waited for the system to come to him, filled out their forms, played their game, and lost. Wren wasn't waiting for anything. "Colette needs to put together a legal file," Wren continued. "Everything she's found. Ghost petition, the denial, the incident reports from Shepherd's Gate. the complaints that were buried. All of it organized, documented, ready to hand to a lawyer. Beckett said he knows someone. He needs to make that call now, tonight. And I need to write my own statement. What happened at the group home? Why I left? What I found here. A judge needs to hear it from me, not from a file. Emmett was quiet for a long moment. The coffee cooled between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard it before. Ghost would have been proud of you. Ghost would have told me to stop talking and start painting, Wren said. But something in her eyes shifted when she said it. A warmth, a grief. The two things braided together so tightly they were indistinguishable. I'll make the calls, Emmett said. You write your statement. We move first thing in the morning. Wren nodded. She turned to leave, then stopped in the doorway. Emmett? Yeah. Thank you for telling me the truth. Even if it took a while. She left before he could answer. The crew mobilized overnight. Colette, reached by phone, came back to the garage at 10 in the evening and didn't leave until 4 in the morning. She organized the documents into a binder with tab sections. Ghost's custody petition, the court's denial, the evaluator's report citing the broken crown as the disqualifying factor, the sealed incident reports from Shepherd's Gate redacted but damning in their implications, Ghost complaint to child welfare filed and ignored, statements from former residents of Shepherd's Gate that Colette had tracked down through a combination of public records and persistent phone calls. Nolan produced a timeline of Hargrove's activities, the law firm's engagement, the private investigators' movements, the connection between Hargrove's inquiries and the timing of Ghost's custody denial. Laid out in sequence, the pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't coincidence. This was a campaign. Beckett made the call. Margot Brennan. She was a family law attorney operating out of a small practice in Lancaster, 50 minutes east. She'd handled custody cases, foster placements, termination of parental rights, and every other variation of the legal machinery that decided where children lived and who got to call themselves family. She was 54 years old, sharp in a way that didn't bother with pleasantries, and she answered her phone on the second ring despite the hour. Beckett gave her the abbreviated version. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise, and told him to bring everything to a diner off Route 33 at 9 the next morning. Wren spent the night writing. She sat on the couch in the back office with her notebook on her knee and a pen borrowed from Colette's desk. She wrote in longhand because that was how Ghost had taught her to organize her thoughts, and because the act of forming letters by hand slowed her down enough to choose each word with intention. She wrote about Shepherd's Gate, not in generalities but in specifics, dates, names, incidents she had witnessed, and incidents she had experienced. She wrote about Kendrick, the supervisor who had thrown her sketchbook in the trash. She wrote about the girl who lost outdoor privileges for asking for seconds. She wrote about the boy moved to isolation for crying. She wrote about the rules that changed depending on who was enforcing them, about punishments, calibrated not to correct behavior, but to assert dominance. She wrote about Ghost, about the weekends he'd come to wherever she was placed, bringing art supplies, teaching her to see the world in shapes and shadows and light, about the way he'd kneel beside her on the floor of whatever temporary room she occupied and guide her hand across the paper, showing her how to find the line that lived inside every blank surface, waiting to be released. She wrote about the night she left, the sketchbook in the dumpster, the side door that nobody remembered to lock, the highway in the dark, her brother's jacket swallowing her frame, his letter hidden in the lining, pointing her toward a place she'd never been and people she'd never met. When she finished, the sky outside the grimy windows was beginning to lighten. She read through what she'd written, made corrections in the margins, and set the notebook aside. Then she lay down on the couch, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and slept for 90 minutes with her hand resting over the dog tag beneath her shirt. The diner was the kind of place that survived on truckers and locals and bottomless coffee. Formica tables, vinyl booths, a counter with chrome stools that spun. A waitress who'd been there since the Reagan administration called everyone honey and refilled cups without being asked. Margot Brennan was already seated when they arrived. She occupied a booth near the back, facing the door, with a briefcase on the seat beside her and a cup of coffee that she'd apparently been working on for some time. She was a compact woman with steel gray hair, pulled back in a clip, and eyes that assessed everything and revealed nothing. Her blazer had seen better seasons. Her shoes were practical. She wore no jewelry except a watch that looked like it had been designed for function rather than fashion. Emmett slid into the booth across from her. Wren sat beside him, Colette took a chair from a nearby table and positioned it at the end. Beckett stood. Margot ordered a fresh round of coffee without asking if anyone wanted it. Then she opened the binder Colette had prepared and began reading. She read fast flipping pages with a practiced hand, her eyes scanning each document with a mechanic's precision, looking for the piece that didn't fit. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask questions. She absorbed. When she finished, she closed the binder and set her hands flat on the table. She looked at Wren. Tell me about the group home. It's in the binder. I read the binder. Now I want to hear it from you. Wren met her gaze. She didn't look at Emmett for permission or at Colette for support. She looked at Margot the way one professional looks at another when evaluating whether a collaboration is worth pursuing. She told her, not the sanitized version, not the version she'd tell a social worker or a school counselor. The real version delivered in a voice that was steady and controlled and carried beneath it a current of anger so cold it made the coffee steam seem warm by comparison. She told Margot about Kendrick, about the arbitrary punishments, about the dog tags taken and never returned, about the night she decided that the system designed to protect her was the thing she needed protection from. Margot listened. When Wren finished, the diner hummed around them, other people's conversations and other people's lives flowing past their booth like water around a stone. Do you want to stay with them? Margot asked, tipping her head toward Emmett. Wren paused, not because she was uncertain, but because the question deserved weight. I don't want to go back to the group home. That's not what I asked. Wren looked at Emmett. He sat beside her with his hands folded on the table, his swollen knuckles resting against the formica, and he did not look at her. He looked straight ahead, giving her the space to answer without his influence. Yes, Wren said, I want to stay. Margot nodded once. Then we file an emergency petition for guardianship. We demonstrate systemic failure. We present the custody attempt Garrett made and the reasons it was blocked. We show that the conditions Wren fled from were documented, reported, and ignored, and we prove that the broken crown can provide the stability the state failed to offer. Will it work? Beckett asked from where he stood. Depends on the judge, but we've got more ammunition than most cases like this would ever see, and we've got a minor who can articulate her own position with clarity. That matters. She looked at Emmett. You understand what this means for you? Background checks, home inspections, financial disclosure. The state will put your life under a microscope. I've got nothing to hide. Everyone's got something to hide, Margot said. But as long as it's nothing that endangers her, we can work with it. She pulled a legal pad from her briefcase and began writing. I'll file tomorrow. I'll request an expedited hearing based on the circumstances. With what's in this binder, I can argue that returning Wren to the system poses a greater risk than the current arrangement. It's not a guarantee, but it's a case. The meeting ended with a handshake and a retainer check that Colette wrote from the club's operating account. Margot gathered the binder, tucked it into her briefcase, and left the diner without looking back. In the parking lot, Emmett stood beside the truck and looked at the sky. Morning had settled into its full brightness, the kind of clear Ohio spring day that made you forget how long the winter had been. She's good, Beckett said. She'd better be. They drove back to the garage in a silence that felt different from the one they'd carried for the past few days. Not lighter exactly, but more directed. The silence of people who had a plan and were moving toward it. They weren't prepared for what was waiting. The black sedan was parked across the street from the garage. Not in the lot, not at the curb. Across the street, positioned with a clear sight line to the rolling door, angled as if for observation. It was a rental, clean, anonymous, the kind of car that was designed to be forgettable. Two men stood beside it. The first was tall, thin, wearing a charcoal suit that looked expensive and uncomfortable in equal measure. He held a leather portfolio under one arm and had the polished, patient expression of someone who billed by the hour. The second man was Dominic Hargrove. He was younger than Wren had expected, late 40s, maybe early 50s, solidly built with broad shoulders and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something harder than bone. His hair was dark, combed back, silvering at the temples. He wore a vest over a pressed shirt, no tie, and shoes that had never seen gravel before today. His hands were clasped in front of him, and his posture radiated the confidence of someone convinced he held every card that mattered. The crew stopped. Emmett's truck idled in the lot. Through the windshield, Wren could see Hargrove looking directly at the vehicle, and she felt something move through her that was neither fear nor anger, but something older and colder. Recognition, not of the man himself, but of the type. She had met Dominic Hargrove 100 times before in 100 different forms. The social worker who smiled while confiscating her belongings. The evaluator who wrote unfit without looking up from his clipboard. The supervisor who threw her sketchbook in the trash without a flicker of conscience. Men who used systems as weapons and called it concern. Emmett reached for the door handle. Wren put her hand on his arm. Let me. He looked at her. Something passed between them, a negotiation conducted entirely in silence. He came here to provoke a reaction, Wren said. If you go out there, he gets what he wants. An angry old biker confronting a man in a suit outside a garage. That's the picture he needs. That's the picture his lawyer will describe to a judge. Emmett's hand tightened on the door handle. Every instinct he'd built over 68 years of living told him to get out of the truck and put himself between this man and Ghost's sister. That was what men like Emmett did. They stood up. They stepped forward. They put their bodies in the way. But Wren was right and he knew it. She opened her door and stepped out. The gravel crunched beneath her worn sneakers. She walked across the lot with her hands at her sides, her back straight, Ghost's jacket hanging from her shoulders like a mantle. She crossed the street and stopped 5 feet from Dominic Hargrove. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. The height difference was absurd. She barely reached his chest. The morning light fell across them both without preference, illuminating the man in his press vest and the girl in her brother's jacket with equal clarity. Hargrove spoke first. His voice was measured, controlled, and carried a warmth that was as manufactured as his posture. You must be Wren, and you must be the man who's been paying someone to follow me. The warmth flickered, just for a moment, a hairline fracture in the performance. His lawyer shifted his weight. Hargrove recovered. I'm a concerned citizen. When I heard that a minor had gone missing from a state facility, I felt it was my civic responsibility to ensure her safety. My safety. Wren repeated the word like she was examining it for defects. That's what brought you here, to a motorcycle garage in rural Ohio, out of civic responsibility. The circumstances are concerning, Wren. You're a child living in a facility with no formal guardianship arrangements surrounded by individuals who, whatever their intentions, are not equipped to provide the kind of structured environment a young person needs. You mean the kind of structured environment where they throw your belongings in the trash and punish you for asking for food? Another flicker. Smaller this time, but Wren caught it. She was reading him the way she read rooms cataloging every micro-expression, every involuntary tell. The slight tightening around his eyes when she referenced the group home. The way his fingers adjusted their clasp when she mentioned being followed. He was practiced at this, but she was better at seeing through practice. She'd been watching Liars since she was 9 years old. I understand you've been through difficult experiences, Hargrove said. That's exactly why I want to make sure you're placed somewhere appropriate, somewhere with proper oversight, proper resources. Somewhere you choose. The lawyer stepped forward. Miss Caldwell, my client's only interest is your welfare. If the current arrangement isn't... I didn't ask you, Wren said without looking at him. She kept her eyes on Hargrove. I know who you are. I know about the Ashen Wolves. I know what you think my brother did. And I know you've been trying to get to me since before he died. Hargrove's composure held, but the effort was visible now. A muscle in his jaw twitched. His hands separated from their clasp, then reclaimed it. I don't know what you've been told, he began. I've been told nothing. I've figured it out myself. That's something people keep underestimating about me. She let the silence sit for a beat. 2 beats. Long enough for Hargrove to feel its weight. You came here hoping to find a scared kid hiding behind a bunch of bikers, Wren said. That's the story you need. The helpless minor, the irresponsible club, the system stepping in to save the day. But that's not what's happening here, and I think you can see that. She took 1 step back, not a retreat, a conclusion. You can talk to our lawyer, she said. Her name is Margot Brennan. She'll be in touch. Wren turned and walked back across the street. She did not hurry. She did not look back. She crossed the lot, climbed into the truck, and closed the door. Inside, Emmett sat with his hands on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The expression on his face said everything. A complicated mixture of admiration and something close to awe directed at a 14-year-old girl who had just faced down a man twice her age and 3 times her resources and given him nothing he could use. Through the windshield, Wren watched Hargrove and his lawyer exchange words. The lawyer was shaking his head. Hargrove's jaw was tight. After a moment, they got into the sedan. The engine started. The car pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the road, trailing a thin cloud of gravel dust. He's not done, Wren said quietly. No, Emmett agreed. He's not. He's going to go to the court and argue that I'm being held here against my will by people with a criminal association. He's going to frame himself as a concerned citizen and the club as a danger. He's got money and he's got patience and he's got 5 years of planning behind him. So what do we do? Wren looked at Emmett. We prove him wrong, not with words, with evidence. The mural, the paintings, the work I've done here, my statement, Beckett's testimony, everything Colette compiled. We build a picture that's stronger than the one he's trying to paint, and we put it in front of a judge before he can finish his. The next 72 hours moved with the compressed intensity of a countdown. Margot filed the emergency petition on Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, she'd received confirmation that the hearing was scheduled for Friday. 2 days. Colette spent Wednesday and Thursday refining the binder. She added photographs of Wren's work in the garage, the completed gas tank, the helmets, the fenders, the commissioned pieces that writers from across the county had begun requesting. Each photograph was dated and annotated, creating a visual record of productivity, skill, and purpose. Beckett prepared his testimony with Margot over the phone. She coached him through the questions he'd likely face. Why should a motorcycle club be trusted with a child's welfare? What evidence of stability could he provide? What safeguards were in place? Beckett answered each question honestly without embellishment, and Margot told him that honesty was the only strategy that worked in family court, because judges had heard every lie ever invented and could spot a new one before it finished leaving your mouth. Nolan continued his research on Hargrove. He found that the private investigator had filed a formal report with Child Protective Services on Monday, confirming Wren's location at the Broken Crown Garage. The report described the environment as unsuitable for a minor and recommended immediate intervention. The language was careful and precise, clearly drafted by someone with legal training. Hargrove's fingerprints were all over it without his name appearing anywhere. Rowan kept painting. He worked alongside Wren on the mural every evening, adding depth to the background, refining the flames laying in the shadows that gave the piece its sense of motion and urgency. He didn't talk about the hearing. He didn't talk about Hargrove. He talked about pigment ratios and brush techniques and the way Ghost used to blend colors by instinct rather than theory. He kept Wren anchored in the work and the craft, in the thing that connected her to her brother and to the club and to the best version of herself. Wren painted with a focus that bordered on ferocity. The mural expanded and deepened. The writers gained dimension. Their faces, rendered with painstaking specificity, captured something beyond mere likeness. She painted their weathered hands and their road-worn jackets and the particular lean of their bodies on their machines, and each figure carried not just a face but a history. You could look at the mural and understand that these men had lived, had lost, had chosen to keep writing anyway. Ghost remained at the center. His motorcycle was the most detailed element on the wall, every chrome surface and every custom detail recreated from memory with a fidelity that made the other writers stop and stare when they saw it. His face was turned slightly as if looking over his shoulder at the writer behind him. The girl, still sketched in pencil, still unfinished. On Thursday night, the eve of the hearing, the garage emptied one by one. Colette closed her laptop at 9. Nolan left at 9:30. Beckett called his wife from the parking lot, his voice low and serious. Rowan cleaned his brushes, hung his apron, and nodded to Wren on his way out. A nod that carried everything he couldn't say in words. Emmett was the last. He found Wren standing in front of the mural. She held a brush in her right hand. Her left hand rested at her side, and beneath the collar of her shirt, Ghost's dog tag caught the light from the overhead fluorescence. She was looking at the unfinished figure. The pencil outline of a girl on a motorcycle positioned behind Ghost, drafted with the same precision as everything else on the wall, but committed to nothing. No paint, no color, just lines and possibility. Emmett stood beside her, close enough to be present, far enough to give her room. They looked at the mural together in the silence of the empty garage. "You haven't finished her," Emmett said. Wren shook her head. "I can't. Can't or won't." She considered the question. It deserved consideration. "Both, maybe. I don't know what she looks like yet. She looks like you. She looks like who I might be. That's different." Wren turned the brush in her fingers, rolling it back and forth against her thumb. "If I paint her, she becomes permanent. She becomes part of the wall, part of the story. And I don't know yet if I belong in this story." Emmett was quiet for a long time. The heater hummed. The garage ticked and settled around them, the way old buildings do at night, releasing the heat of the day in small sounds. Your brother told me something once, Emmett said. Years ago, before the custody fight, before any of it. We were sitting right here in this garage after a long ride. Everyone else had gone home. Just the two of us, and the bikes, and a bottle of whiskey that was almost gone. Wren didn't move, but her stillness changed. It became a listening stillness. The stillness of someone who has been waiting to hear something without knowing what it was. He said he had someone depending on him. He didn't say who, didn't give me a name, but he said that everything he did, every mile he rode, every dollar he earned, every piece he painted, it was all for this person. And he said that if anything ever happened to him, this person might come looking. And when they did, he needed us to be ready. Emmett's voice had gone rough, not with volume, but with the erosion of a man speaking through 68 years of accumulated loss. I didn't understand it then, he said. I do now. He was right about us. He was right that you'd come, and we're not going to let him down. Wren stood motionless. The brush in her hand had stopped turning. Her eyes stayed on the mural on Ghost's face, looking back over his shoulder on the girl behind him, who waited in graphite for a future she hadn't been granted. What if the judge says no? Wren asked. Then we figure out the next step, and the step after that. We don't stop because someone in a robe tells us to. That sounds like something Ghost would say. Where do you think I learned it? Wren looked at him. Emmett Braxton, 68 years old, hands ruined by arthritis and decades of gripping handlebars in the cold. A man who had buried more friends than most people ever made. He stood beside her in the fluorescent light of a garage that smelled like paint and coffee and engine grease, and he did not look away from her, and he did not promise her that everything would be fine. He promised her that he would not quit, and she understood with a clarity that cut through every layer of defense she'd built over 5 years of surviving alone, that this was the only promise worth anything. She turned back to the mural. She raised the brush. For a moment, she held it near the wall, near the penciled outline of the girl on the motorcycle. Then she lowered it. Tomorrow, she said, after the hearing, I'll know then. Emmett nodded. He placed his hand on her shoulder briefly, the way you'd steady someone before a long ride. Then he walked away, his boots heavy on the concrete, and left her alone with the mural and the unfinished figure, and the morning that was already gathering beyond the grimy windows, carrying with it a courtroom and a judge and a verdict that would determine whether the girl on the wall would ever be painted at all. Wren set her brush down. She pressed her palm flat against the wall, against the bare concrete where the figure waited in pencil lines. She could feel the texture of the surface beneath her skin, cold, rough, unfinished. Like her, she turned off the work lights, walked to the back office, and lay down on the couch. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark with Ghost's dog tag against her chest and listened to the garage settle around her, the creaks and sighs of a building that had stood for decades and would stand for decades more, indifferent to the dramas of the people it sheltered. When sleep finally came, she did not dream. She rested the way she always rested, lightly and efficiently, one ear open, one hand closed around the metal tag that bore her brother's name, ready for whatever the morning would bring. The courthouse was a limestone building on the edge of the county seat, 3 stories of institutional architecture that had been designed to look imposing and had succeeded only in looking tired. The steps leading to the entrance were worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, and the columns flanking the front door needed paint in a way that suggested they had needed it for years and would continue needing it for years to come. An American flag hung limp from a pole on the roof. No wind. The morning was still and clear, the sky a washed-out blue that offered neither warmth nor drama. Wren climbed the steps between Emmett and Colette. She wore the only clothes she had that weren't stained with paint. A pair of jeans Colette had bought her 2 days ago, a white shirt that was slightly too large. Ghost's jacket, which she refused to leave behind, hanging from her shoulders in its familiar oversized drape. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that she'd actually brushed. Her sketchbook was tucked under her arm. Ghost's dog tag rested against her sternum, beneath the white shirt, invisible but present. Behind them, Beckett and Rowan walked in silence. Nolan had stayed at the garage. Someone needed to be there in case anything happened, and Nolan had volunteered with the quiet understanding that his role in this particular chapter was best played from the wings. Margot Brennan was already inside. She stood in the corridor outside courtroom B, her briefcase at her feet, reviewing notes on a legal pad with the focused calm of a surgeon preparing for an operation. She wore the same blazer she'd worn at the diner, and her steel gray hair was pulled back in the same clip. She looked up when they approached, assessed the group with a single sweep of her eyes, and nodded once. The judge is Patricia Musgrave, Margot said. She's been on the family bench for 12 years. She's thorough, she doesn't tolerate grandstanding, and she reads every document you put in front of her, Donna. That works in our favor because what we have on paper is stronger than what they have. Who's representing the state? Emmett asked. An assistant county attorney named Galbraith. He's competent, but overworked. He'll argue procedure. The system exists for a reason. Minors belong in approved placements. You're not an approved placement. Standard stuff. And Hargrove, Margot's expression tightened by a fraction. He's here. He filed a motion to be recognized as an interested party. His attorney is a man named Fairchild from the same firm that handled the investigation into the Broken Crown 5 years ago. Can he do that? Colette asked. Just insert himself into a custody hearing. Anyone can file a motion. Whether the judge allows it is another question. Fairchild will argue that Hargrove has standing as a concerned community member with relevant knowledge about the respondents. It's thin, but it's not unprecedented. Wren listened to all of this with the focused stillness that the crew had come to recognize as her processing mode. She absorbed information the way she absorbed color and composition, taking in the full picture before committing to a response. What do I need to do? She asked. Margot looked at her directly. You'll be called to speak. The judge will ask you questions. Answer them honestly. Don't perform. Don't editorialize. If you don't know the answer to something, say so. The strongest thing you have going for you is that you're articulate and credible. Don't undermine that by trying to be something you're not. And the sketchbook? I'll introduce it as evidence of your productivity and engagement in the current placement. It demonstrates stability and purpose. The judge will want to see it. Wren nodded. She held the sketchbook a little tighter against her side. They entered the courtroom at 8:55. It was smaller than Wren had expected. No gallery, no jury box. A single bench at the front elevated on a platform of dark wood. 2 tables facing the bench separated by an aisle. A court reporter stationed to the side. A clerk's desk. Fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency just below conscious perception but above comfort. Wren took her seat at the left table between Emmett and Colette. Margot sat at the end, her binder open, her legal pad positioned for notes. Beckett and Rowan sat in the 2 chairs behind them, the only seating available for observers in a courtroom this size. At the right table, Assistant County Attorney Galbraith was already seated. He was a thin man in his 40s with a receding hairline and the slightly harried look of someone managing too many cases with too few hours. His files were stacked in a neat pile, and he reviewed them with the mechanical efficiency of routine. Beside Galbraith, at the far end of the same table, sat Dominic Hargrove and his attorney. Fairchild was tall and narrow with silver hair, in a suit that cost more than everything in Margot's closet combined. He sat with his legs crossed and his hands folded on the table, projecting an ease that was designed to communicate confidence. Hargrove sat beside him, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed forward. He did not look at Wren. He did not look at Emmett. He looked at the empty bench where the judge would sit, and he waited. Judge Musgrave entered at 9 sharp. She was a woman in her 60s, compact and precise in her movements with short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She settled into her chair, arranged her materials, and surveyed the courtroom with the measured attention of someone accustomed to seeing through surfaces. We're here on an emergency petition for temporary guardianship of a minor, she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried. Filed by Margot Brennan on behalf of Emmett Braxton. I've reviewed the initial filings. Let's begin. Galbraith went first. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and presented the state's position with the rehearsed fluency of a man who had delivered similar arguments hundreds of times. The minor Wren Caldwell, age 14, had absconded from a state-approved residential facility 8 weeks prior. She had been located at a private establishment, the Broken Crown Motorcycle Club garage, in the custody of individuals who had no legal authority over her and who had not been vetted, approved, or supervised by any child welfare agency. The state's position was straightforward. The system existed to protect children. The system had procedures. The procedures existed for reasons. Wren Caldwell belonged in an approved placement where her safety, education, and development could be monitored and supported by trained professionals. Galbraith sat down. He had not been passionate or dismissive. He had been procedural, the system speaking its own language on its own behalf. Margot stood. She did not button her jacket. She did not consult her notes. She looked at the judge and began. Your Honor, the state's position assumes that the system it describes is functioning. Our evidence will show that it is not. It will show that the system failed Wren Caldwell before she ever left Shepherd's Gate. It will show that her brother Garrett Caldwell identified that failure, attempted to intervene, and was blocked by the same system that now claims authority over his sister's welfare. She opened the binder. Methodically, without rushing, she walked the judge through each document. Ghost custody petition, the evaluator's annal based on his association with the Broken Crown. The sealed incident reports from Shepherd's Gate that referenced conditions the state had been notified about and had declined to investigate. Ghost's formal complaint to child welfare filed 3 weeks after the custody denial, documenting specific allegations of inappropriate disciplinary measures and emotional abuse. The complaint had been acknowledged, logged, and closed. Insufficient evidence. No follow-up. No site visit. No interview with the minor in question. Margot let each document speak. She did not editorialize. She did not raise her voice. She placed the facts before the judge like stones on a scale and let gravity do the work. Then she called Becket Pritchard to the stand. Becket walked to the witness chair with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that every step he took was being measured. He sat down, stated his name for the record, and waited. Margot asked him about his family. 3 children, married 21 years, homeowner, employed. She asked him about the Broken Crown, how long he'd been a member, what the club did, what it meant to him. Becket spoke simply. He didn't try to sanitize the club or make it into something it wasn't. He described it as a community of men who rode motorcycles, maintained their machines, and looked after each other. He acknowledged that the club's image carried certain associations, and he didn't apologize for them. He said that he had seen those associations used against good people, and that the denial of Garrett Caldwell's custody petition was the clearest example he knew of a system punishing someone for the company he kept rather than the parent he would have been. Margot asked him about Wren. Becket paused. He looked across the courtroom at the girl sitting between Emmett and Colette, her sketchbook on the table in front of her ghost jacket on her shoulders. She walked into our garage with nothing but a backpack and a drawing on a napkin, he said. She asked if she could paint. She didn't ask for shelter. She didn't ask for food. She didn't ask for anything except the chance to do the one thing her brother taught her to do. And she's better at it than anyone I've ever seen. Better than her brother? Different. But yes, she's 14 years old, and she paints like someone who's been doing it for 40 years. She's already got commissions from riders across the county. She works every day sunrise to past midnight sometimes. She's got a purpose and a skill and a place where people care about her. That's more than the group home ever gave her. Fairchild cross-examined briefly. He asked Becket whether the Broken Crown had any formal childcare qualifications, whether anyone at the garage had been trained in adolescent development, whether the sleeping arrangements, a couch and a back office, met state standards for housing a minor. Becket answered each question honestly. No, probably not. But he added unprompted and with a steadiness that Fairchild couldn't redirect that no amount of formal qualification had prevented the conditions at Shepherd's Gate, and no lack of certification had stopped the Broken Crown from being the first place in 5 years where Wren Caldwell felt safe enough to sleep through the night. Fairchild sat down. Judge Musgrave made a note. It was at this point that Fairchild stood again and requested recognition for his client Dominic Hargrove as an interested party with relevant testimony regarding the suitability of the proposed guardians. Margot objected. She argued that Hargrove had no familial relationship to the minor, no legal standing in the custody question, and that his involvement appeared motivated by personal grievance rather than concern for the child's welfare. Judge Musgrave looked at Fairchild over her reading glasses. What is your client's specific interest in this matter? My client is a community member who became aware that a missing minor was being housed in an unlicensed facility operated by a motorcycle club with a documented history of... I asked about his interest, counselor, not his resume. Fairchild recalibrated. Mr. Hargrove has personal knowledge of the Broken Crown Motorcycle Club and its members. He believes this information is relevant to the court's assessment of the proposed guardianship arrangement. Personal knowledge based on what relationship? A pause. Fairchild glanced at Hargrove. Hargrove gave a slight nod. Mr. Hargrove's brother, Vincent Hargrove, died in a motorcycle accident 5 years ago. The same evening that Garrett Caldwell, the minor's brother, and a founding member of the Broken Crown, also died in a separate accident. Mr. Hargrove has long had concerns about the circumstances surrounding both incidents. Judge Musgrave studied Hargrove for a long moment. Then she looked at Margot. Ms. Brennan, any response? Your Honor, the fact that Mr. Hargrove harbors suspicions about events from 5 years ago is precisely the reason his involvement in this hearing should concern the court, not justify it. This is a guardianship proceeding for a 14-year-old girl. It is not a venue for relitigating traffic fatalities. Judge Musgrave held up a hand. I'll allow Mr. Hargrove limited participation. He may offer a statement, but I'm not opening this hearing to unrelated matters. Keep it relevant, counselor, or I'll shut it down. Fairchild nodded. Hargrove's expression remained neutral, but something shifted behind his eyes. A satisfaction. A door opening. Margot leaned toward Wren. This changes the dynamic slightly. Stay steady. Wren didn't respond. She was watching Hargrove with focused attention. Not with fear, with scrutiny. Margot turned back to the judge. Your Honor, before Mr. Hargrove offers his statement, petitioners would like to call one more witness, Wren Caldwell. Judge Musgrave nodded. Wren stood. She picked up her sketchbook from the table. She walked to the witness chair with the same measured gait she'd used to cross the garage that first day, in the courtroom that first morning, in the street to face Hargrove. Her sneakers made no sound on the courtroom carpet. She sat down, placed the sketchbook on her lap, and looked at the judge. Wren, Judge Musgrave said. Her voice had softened, though not by much. The softness of a woman who had presided over hundreds of cases involving children and had learned that condescension was the fastest way to lose their trust. Can you tell me in your own words how you came to be at the Broken Crown garage? Wren nodded. She began with Ghost, not with the custody petition or the legal documents or the systemic failures. She began with the person, her brother Garrett Caldwell, who everyone called Ghost, a painter, a motorcycle rider, the person who had taught her everything she knew about seeing the world. She described the weekends, how Ghost would come to whatever foster home or group placement she was in, bringing pencils and paper and small tins of paint that fit in his jacket pockets. How he'd sit on the floor beside her and draw with her for hours, teaching her to see shapes and shadows and movement in stillness. How he'd tell her stories about the Broken Crown, about the men he rode with, about the machines he painted. How he promised her every single visit that he was working on getting her out. She described the night he died. She was 9 years old. A social worker came to the group home and told her that her brother had been in an accident and that he wasn't coming back. The social worker used the word past as if Ghost had simply moved from one room to another and forgotten to leave a forwarding address. She described what came after. The foster homes, the transfers, the slow erosion of hope that happens when a child realizes that the system managing her life does not see her as a person, but as a case number, a problem to be processed, a line item in a budget. She described Shepherd's Gate. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She spoke with the controlled precision of someone who had rehearsed not the words but the composure required to deliver them. And then she stopped. The courtroom waited. Your Honor, Wren said, I'd like to show you something. She opened the sketchbook. She held it up so the judge could see the first page. A motorcycle drawn in pencil, every detail rendered with photographic accuracy. Ghost's bike, the one he rode the night he died. She turned the page. Another motorcycle, then a helmet, then a portrait of a man with white hair and swollen knuckles sitting in a folding chair near a space heater. Emmett, drawn from memory, drawn with love, drawn with the skill of someone who understood that a portrait was not about capturing a face, but about capturing the life behind it. She turned more pages. The crew, Rowan at his paint bay, Beckett leaning against a toolbox, Colette at her desk. Each one rendered with the same meticulous attention. Each one a testament to observation, to presence, to belonging. Then she turned to a section near the back of the book. Pages she had not shown anyone. Pages she had kept hidden, folded against the binding held in place with tape that she now peeled away in the silence of the courtroom. These pages were different. The drawings were smaller, tighter, more urgent. They weren't portraits or motorcycles. They were records. Dates written in the margins. Names. Specific incidents documented in a combination of sketches and handwritten notes. A floor plan of Shepherd's Gate drawn from memory with rooms labeled and annotations marking where specific events had occurred. A detailed rendering of the supervisor's office, the desk, the trash can beside it, the sketchbook lying in the trash. A notation beside it in Wren's careful handwriting, recording the date, the time, and the supervisor's name. Kendrick. More pages. A girl sitting alone in a room with no furniture except a metal cot. Notation isolation room used for punishment. A list of dates, a list of names. Children Wren had known at Shepherd's Gate with brief descriptions of what had happened to them and when. A boy punished for crying. A girl who lost privileges for asking for seconds. Another boy transferred after he complained to a social worker, and the notation beside his name said simply gone the next day, never saw him again. The courtroom was silent. Judge Musgrave had put on her reading glasses and was leaning forward examining each page as Wren held the sketchbook up. Galbraith had stopped shuffling his papers. Fairchild's crossed legs had uncrossed. Hargrove sat perfectly still, but the color in his face had shifted. Something behind his calculated composure was recalculating. I started keeping records 3 weeks after I arrived at Shepherd's Gate, Wren said. Her words carried through the small courtroom without effort, reaching every corner. I knew nobody would listen to me if I just told them what was happening. I'd tried telling social workers before. They wrote things down and nothing changed. So I started documenting everything I could. Dates, names, what happened, where it happened. I drew the layout of the building so someone could verify it. I drew the people so someone could identify them. She looked at the judge. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just knew that someone should know. And I knew that if I kept it in my sketchbook mixed in with the drawings, nobody would think to look. Judge Musgrave extended her hand. May I? Wren handed the sketchbook over. The judge opened it to the hidden section and began turning pages, slowly reading each annotation, studying each drawing. The courtroom waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. The fluorescent lights hummed their tuneless hum. Emmett sat with his hands folded on the table, his breathing measured, his eyes on Wren. When the judge looked up, her expression had changed. The shift was subtle, visible in the set of her jaw and the focus of her gaze. She had seen something in those pages that went beyond the scope of a guardianship petition. This is a detailed record, the judge said. It's what I had, Wren replied. It's what I could do. Judge Musgrave set the sketchbook down on the bench. She turned to Galbraith. Has Child Protective Services conducted any investigation into conditions at Shepherd's Gate in the past 3 years? Galbraith shifted in his seat. I'd need to check the records, Your Honor. Check them. I want an answer before we conclude today. Galbraith made a note. His pen moved quickly. The confidence of routine had left his posture. Fairchild rose. Your Honor, while the minor's artistic ability is not in question, the relevance of these drawings to the guardianship petition is unclear. The question before the court is whether the proposed guardians are suitable, not whether the previous placement had deficiencies. Sit down, counselor, Judge Musgrave said. The relevance is self-evident. If the system the state is asking me to return this child to has a documented pattern of failure that is material to my decision. Fairchild sat. Hargrove's jaw tightened. Margot stood. Your Honor, I have one more matter to bring before the court. It pertains directly to the question of why we're here today and who brought us here. Proceed. Margot nodded to Wren, and Wren understood. This was the moment she had prepared for in the quiet hours of the previous night, lying on the couch in the back office, turning the pieces over in her mind, fitting them together until the picture became clear. Your Honor, Wren said from the witness chair. She did not look at Margot for guidance. She did not look at Emmett for support. She looked at the judge. I'd like to explain how I came to understand why Mr. Hargrove is in this courtroom. Fairchild started to rise. Judge Musgrave's hands stopped him without a word. Wren spoke carefully. She laid out the facts the way she'd lay out a composition on a blank surface. First the structure, then the detail, then the connections. She described finding Ghost's unfinished letter in the crate at the garage. The letter that mentioned a man from the past who was working to sabotage his custody petition. She described what Colette and Nolan had found in the club's digital archives, without naming specific documents, keeping her account to what she personally understood and could speak to. She described the timeline. 5 years ago, Ghost filed for custody. At the same time, a law firm began conducting background checks on the broken crown checks that were commissioned by a private client. The custody petition was denied based on Ghost's association with the club. 3 weeks later, Ghost filed a complaint about conditions at Shepherd's Gate. The complaint was dismissed without investigation. 6 weeks after that, Ghost was dead. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Wren said. Her voice remained level, measured. I'm presenting events in the order they happened. My brother tried to get custody of me. Someone hired a law firm to investigate the club he belonged to. The investigation provided the basis for denying his petition. After the denial, my brother tried to report the conditions I was living in, and that report was ignored. My brother died before he could try again. She paused. The courtroom held its breath. 5 years later, I left Shepherd's Gate because the conditions my brother reported had not changed. I came to the Broken Crown because my brother told me to. And within weeks of my arrival, a private investigator began tracking my location. That investigator was hired by the same law firm that conducted the background checks 5 years ago. And that law firm's client then and now is sitting in this courtroom. She looked at Hargrove, not with anger, not with fear, with the steady, unblinking clarity of someone who had taken 1,000 scattered pieces and assembled them into a single coherent image. Hargrove looked back at her. For the first time since the hearing began, his composure fractured in a way that was visible to everyone in the room. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His hands clasped on the table separated and gripped the table's edge. The mask of civic concern had cracked, and beneath it was something raw and ancient and personal. "This isn't about my safety," Wren said quietly. "It never was. This is about my brother. And I'm not my brother. I'm not responsible for what Mr. Hargrove believes happened to his family. I'm sorry for his loss, but I won't pay for it." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their hum. Judge Musgrave removed her reading glasses. She set them on the bench beside the sketchbook and looked at Hargrove for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "do you wish to make your statement?" Fairchild leaned toward his client and whispered something urgent. Hargrove didn't appear to hear him. He was still looking at Wren, and his expression had changed in a way that was difficult to categorize. The anger was still there, deep and structural, but something else had surfaced alongside it. Something closer to the vertigo of a man who has been walking in one direction for 5 years and suddenly realizes the ground beneath him has shifted. Hargrove stood. Fairchild reached for his arm. Hargrove pulled away. "My brother was everything to me," Hargrove said. His voice was thick, controlled but barely. "Vincent was the only family I had. When he died, I needed someone to hold responsible. The official reports said it was an accident. Separate incidents, separate highways. But I couldn't accept that. I couldn't accept that two men from rival clubs could die on the same night, and it meant nothing." He paused. His hands were at his sides, and they were trembling. "I spent 5 years looking for answers. I hired investigators. I hired lawyers. I went after the Broken Crown because I believed they were responsible. And when Caldwell died before I could confront him, I looked for the next closest thing." His eyes moved to Wren. Something in them broke. A fracture beneath the surface, the kind that doesn't show on the outside until much later, when the weight it was holding finally shifts. "She's a child," he said, not to the judge, not to his lawyer, to himself or to the courtroom, or to the version of himself that had spent 5 years building a machine designed to destroy a 14-year-old girl's chance at a life. "She's a child, and I've been treating her like a target." Fairchild was on his feet. "Your Honor, my client is understandably emotional. I'd request a brief recess." "No," Hargrove said. He said it quietly, but it landed like a door closing. "No recess. I'm done." He sat down. He did not look at Fairchild. He did not look at Wren. He looked at the table in front of him, at his own hands, at the tremor that he could not stop. Judge Musgrave watched him for a moment. Then she turned to Galbraith. "Counselor, do you have anything to add?" Galbraith stood slowly. He looked at his files at the judge at the sketchbook on the bench. He appeared to be conducting a rapid internal calculation, weighing the state's position against what had just unfolded in the room. "The state's primary concern remains the welfare of the minor," he said carefully. "However, in light of the evidence presented today, the state does not object to the court considering the emergency petition on its merits." It was not an endorsement. It was a step back, a recognition that the ground had shifted and that standing firm on procedure would only draw attention to the cracks in the foundation. Judge Musgrave nodded. She picked up the sketchbook again. She opened it to the section of drawings documenting Shepherd's Gate. She turned pages slowly, one at a time. The courtroom waited. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent 12 years on the family bench and had seen every permutation of failure, neglect, and occasional redemption that the intersection of children and institutions could produce. "I've reviewed the petition, the supporting documents, and the evidence presented in this hearing. I've heard testimony from Mr. Pritchard and from the minor herself. And I've examined a sketchbook that represents, in my experience, one of the most detailed and credible records of institutional conditions I've ever seen produced by a minor in the care of the state. She looked at Wren. You did this on your own. Yes, ma'am. No one told you to. No one knew. The judge held her gaze for a moment. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of resilience, of intelligence applied under pressure toward a purpose that most adults would never have conceived of, let alone executed. I'm granting the emergency petition, Judge Musgrave said. Temporary guardianship of Wren Caldwell is awarded to Emmett Braxton with the Broken Crown Motorcycle Club, recognized as the primary residential environment. This arrangement is subject to the following conditions: regular visits from a court-appointed social worker, monthly status reports filed by the guardian, enrollment in an accredited educational program within 30 days. Any violation of these conditions will result in immediate review and potential revocation. She turned to Galbraith. I'm also ordering an independent investigation into conditions at Shepherd's Gate Residential Facility based on the evidence in this sketchbook. I want a report on my desk within 60 days. Then she looked at Hargrove. Mr. Hargrove, I'm referring the information presented today regarding your involvement in the original custody denial to the appropriate authorities for review. I'd advise you to cooperate fully with any inquiries that follow. Hargrove did not respond. He sat with his head slightly bowed, his hands flat on the table, perfectly still. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down, a small sound wood on wood that carried more finality than anything else said or done in that room. Wren exhaled. It was the first full breath she'd taken in an hour. Her shoulders dropped. Her hands, which had been clenched in her lap beneath the table's edge, opened. Beside her, Emmett sat with his eyes closed, his lips pressed together, his chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of a man absorbing a weight that had just been lifted. Outside the courtroom, Margot shook Emmett's hand. Her grip was firm, her expression satisfied in the restrained way of someone who measured success by outcomes rather than celebrations. Don't let her down, Margot said. We won't. Margot turned to Wren. She looked at the girl for a long moment, and something in her professional composure softened by a single degree. That was the most effective testimony I've ever seen from a 14-year-old, or from most adults for that matter. Wren shrugged. The motion was almost shy, a reminder that beneath the composure and the courage she was still a child, still learning the dimensions of her own strength. I just told the truth. You did more than that. You organized it. You made it undeniable. Hold on to that. It'll serve you for the rest of your life. Margot picked up her briefcase, nodded to the group, and walked toward the exit. Her heels clicked against the courthouse tile, precise and unhurried, the sound of a woman who had won a fight and was already thinking about the next one. In the corridor, Beckett put his hand on Wren's shoulder. She looked up at him, and for a moment the wall she'd maintained throughout the hearing developed a single visible crack. Her lip trembled. Her eyes brightened. She caught it, steadied it, and the wall held. But Beckett had seen the fracture, and it told him more about what this moment meant to her than any words could have. Rowan said nothing. He stood beside Wren and looked at her with an expression that most people would have mistaken for blankness, but that Wren understood was his highest form of respect. Recognition from one painter to another. Acknowledgement that she had done something extraordinary with the only tools she had. They drove back to the garage in Emmett's truck. The radio was off. The windows were down. The spring air poured through the cab, carrying the smell of cut grass and warming earth. Nobody spoke for the first 5 miles. The silence wasn't awkward or heavy. It was the silence of people who had been through something together and didn't need language to process it. Emmett broke it first. You need to be enrolled in school within 30 days. I heard. You have a preference. Wren looked out the window. Fields rolled past, punctuated by farmhouses and silos, and the occasional cluster of trees budding green. Somewhere with an art program. We'll find one. And I want to keep painting at the garage, after school, weekends. That was never in question. She nodded. The truck bounced over a rough patch of road. She pressed her hand against the front of her shirt, a gesture so habitual it had become unconscious. They arrived at the garage in the early afternoon. The rolling door was open. Inside the garage was different. Nolan had called ahead. Word had spread the way word always spreads in a community built on loyalty and shared history. By the time Emmett's truck pulled into the lot, the garage was full. Riders from across the county, men who'd known ghost men who'd come to see Wren's work over the past weeks, men who had come because they understood something about belonging that no court or system or institution could teach. They lined the walls and leaned against workbenches, and stood in the doorway with their arms folded and their faces carrying a solemnity earned by men who understood what it meant to fight for family and win. And the mural was finished. While Wren had been in the courtroom, Rowan and the crew had completed the piece. The background was filled. The flames burned with a depth and movement that seemed impossible on a flat surface. The riders charged forward in their eternal formation, every detail rendered every face alive. Ghost rode at the center, his motorcycle gleaming, his expression fierce and free, looking back over his shoulder with an intensity that made you feel he could see you wherever you stood. But the figure behind him was still in pencil. The girl on the motorcycle, untouched, unpainted, exactly as Wren had left it. They'd finished everything except the part that was hers to finish. Wren stood in front of the mural. The garage was quiet around her. 24 men stood in a loose semicircle behind her, and not one of them made a sound. Emmett stood to her left, Rowan to her right. The work lights cast the wall in warm amber, and the painted riders seemed to shift and breathe in the glow. She looked at the pencil figure. The outline of a girl on a motorcycle positioned behind Ghost, drafted with care and precision, but committed to nothing. No color, no weight, just the suggestion of a person waiting to be made real. Wren reached for the brush Rowan had set out on the workbench. It was the same fine-tipped brush she'd used on the gas tank the first day she walked in. She picked up the palette. She mixed her colors without looking, the ratios stored in her hands the way melodies are stored in a musician's fingers. She turned to the wall. She raised the brush, and she began. She painted the girl from the wheels up. The motorcycle, first a machine she invented from memory and imagination, borrowing elements from Ghost Bike but making them her own. The frame was lighter. The lines were sharper. The chrome caught light differently, reflecting not the road behind, but the road ahead. Then the rider, thin arms gripping the handlebars, shoulders set forward, leaning into the wind. The oversized jacket, Ghost jacket, painted not as a burden, but as armor. And finally, the face turned forward, eyes open. Expression not fierce like Ghost, not reckless or defiant. Something different, something quieter and more durable. The expression of a person who had looked at everything the world had thrown at her and decided without drama or declaration to keep going. When she set the brush down, the garage was silent for a 3 count that felt like 30. Then someone started clapping. One pair of hands, then another. Then the room filled with the sound, a rolling wave of applause that bounced off the corrugated walls and the oil-stained floor and the grimy windows and came back stronger. Wren didn't turn around. She stood with her hand on the wall, her palm pressed against the still wet paint beside the girl on the motorcycle, and she breathed. Emmett stepped forward. He stood beside her and reached into the inside pocket of his vest. He pulled out something small folded in cloth. He unwrapped it and held it out. A patch, custom made. Wren's initials stitched into the fabric in a style that echoed Ghost's emblem, but was entirely her own. A fractured crown, but the fracture was filled with a brushstroke, a painted line that held the broken pieces together. "You're not running anymore," Emmett said. His voice was rough and certain, and carried across the quiet garage to every man standing along its walls. "You're riding." Wren took the patch. She held it in her palm, feeling the weight of the stitching, the texture of the thread. She looked at Emmett, then at Rowan, then at Beckett and Colette and Nolan, then at the riders lined along the walls, men she barely knew. Men who had come because they understood something about belonging that no court or system or institution could teach. Then she looked at the mural, at Ghost riding at the center of his brothers, looking back over his shoulder, at the girl behind him, finally finished, finally painted, finally real, riding her own machine, eyes forward, moving towards something that no one had promised her, but that she had chosen for herself. Wren Caldwell smiled, a small expression private rather than performed that lived mostly in her eyes. Something had settled inside her that had been unsettled for 5 years. A recognition, a landing. The particular quiet that comes not when the storm passes, but when you stop running from it and realize you have a place to stand. She pressed Ghost's dog tag against her chest one final time. Then she lifted her hand away, tucked the patch into her jacket pocket, and picked up her brush. There was still work to do. There would always be work to do. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, the work felt like a beginning instead of an escape. The garage hummed around her. The space heater ticked. The radio turned low, played a song she didn't recognize, but that sounded like the kind of song Ghost would have liked. The crew drifted back to their tasks, their conversations, their machines. The afternoon light came through the windows, filtered by decades of grime, and fell across the mural in long golden bars that made the riders glow. Ren stood in the paint bay, surrounded by the smell of fresh paint and old coffee and motor oil, and she began working on a new piece. A commission from a writer who'd watched her finish the mural and asked with a voice that cracked slightly on the question if she could paint his tank the way Ghost used to. She could, she would, and she'd add something of her own because that was what Ghost had taught her. Take what you're given, make it better. Leave your mark on the metal and the world and the people who see it, and don't apologize for the audacity of believing you belong. Outside, the Ohio spring deepened towards summer. The gravel lot soaked up the sun. The crooked sign above the rolling door caught the light and cast a shadow that stretched across the threshold like an invitation. Broken Crown MC members only. Inside, a 14-year-old girl painted motorcycles for something better than tips.